Okay, relational scholars, this chapter is chapter 9, Communicating Sexually, the Closest Physical Encounter. This chapter is huge and covers a lot of material, different types of sexual relationships, um, sexual attitudes and orientations, flirting styles, initiations and refusal scripts, sexual communication like pillow talk and relational satisfaction, coercion, harassment, safe sex practices. I mean, there's so much going on. So what we're going to do is we're going to trim this and narrow it down to looking at short-term versus long-term relationships. Excuse me. So we're going to look at a couple different types of short-term relationships, like friends with benefits and hookups. And we're also going to look at some communication dynamics in long-term relationships, long-term relational satisfaction, some of the differences between the genders, or actually really the sexes, men and women, and describe those sexual attitudes. So our learning objectives are going to stick to these four major items on this slide for this chapter. And that's also what you can anticipate being like the exam focusing on. Research shows that sexual interaction, including haptics and physical touch, is a vital part of dating and marital relationships. So, as I just mentioned, we are going to focus on short term relationships like friends with benefits and hookups, and also some long term relationship factors, communication factors, differences between the sexes, and also attitudes about sex in relationships. One of the reasons why we're going to begin with hookups and friends with benefits is because sexual satisfaction is most important in short term relationships. So we know that it's most important in that type of relationship, and also that sex is happening in short term relationships. So sexual non romantic relationships among friends are labeled friends with benefits. And according to research, about 25% of college students have had at least one of these relationships. So it's between 20 and 25%. It's very prevalent in urban and rural high schools among friends and acquaintances, so very socially distant to a little more socially proximate. Um, and another definition for you are hookups, the spontaneous, casual, sexual encounters with an acquaintance or stranger who is not a regular dating partner with no expectations of a long-term relationship. So important to note a couple things: not all hookups culminate in sexual intercourse, and also not all hookups, while all hookups, there's no expectation of a long-term relationship. We know that, in fact, often, with some frequency, long-term relationships are initiated with hookups. So while there's no expectation, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. One area we have a lot of data in is in this quote unquote friends with benefits short term relationship category. So what does this mean? What counts as friends? How is sex defined? Because friends could be a really good friend that knows a lot about you, plus you have sex in that relationship. Or it could, a friend could be someone you are vaguely acquainted with, and you just get together for the purpose of recreational sex without a lot of other leisure activities happening. So, there's a really broad range there. Sex is also kind of murky. How often are we talking about a one night stand? What acts? Are we talking about cuddling, kissing, full blown intercourse? Because you can have physical contact with your friends in a way that is non-sexual, certainly. And so the lines can be a little bit blurry here. And therefore, the definition is quite broad. So our official definition of friends with benefits are friends who have sexual intercourse, and this would imply multiple times. So there is a temporal sense, like of time continuing, a continuation is what separates friends with benefits from a hookup. Which a hookup would be considered, a one-time thing that with no expectation of a reoccurrence. Friends with benefits can begin with a hookup, but if it continues and you casually know this person, it would fall under that umbrella category of friends with benefits. Okay. Romantic partners who have broken up but continue the sexual component of their relationship is actually about a quarter of ex relationships for young people who are dating. And that would probably fall under this umbrella as well. And so depending on whether you would include that or not would influence the percentage. So studies vary between 36% and 62% of college-age students, so 18 to about 23-year-olds in the United States today. I collected some relationship data from UMass Boston students recently, and in a survey, and 45% of respondents said that they had a friends with benefits relationship. And I let the respondent define what that meant to them. And what was interesting about those results is that there were no sex differences. Males were slightly more likely to say that they had a friends with benefits relationship, but only a little bit more. So it was not statistically significant in terms of being a difference. Men and women about equally said that they had or had not. I also saw some associations or correlations with personality characteristics. So friends with benefits relationships were not related to measures of neuroticism or social harmony, but it was related to a greater belief in sociosexuality. And sociosexuality is basically a fancy word for saying an acceptance overall of sexual behaviors. Just generally speaking, do you feel positively or negatively about sex? The higher the answer is yes, I am positive about these things, the higher sociosexuality score you receive. And the higher the sociosexuality score, the higher the likelihood that they had a friends with benefits relationship. On average, friends knew each other a little over a year before the friends with benefits initiated. I also noted on average, the general trend is that friends with benefits relationships lasted about 6 months. Only about 20% said it had happened only once. So that's a strong minority are only doing the benefits once. The rest said that there were repeated encounters involving, physical sexuality. One interesting communication phenomenon surrounding friends with benefits relationships is that a lot of times, 85% of the time, in fact, people say they do not talk about the status of their relationship with their friend with benefits. And 73% of people with friends with benefits relationships are not setting ground rules ahead of time. The vast takeaway is that a majority of people who are doing it aren't talking about it. And this makes it hard for communication researchers because there is a dearth of actual talk. On this slide, we see 85% don't have an SOR talk. That stands for state of the relationship. So that's the explicit meta communication. What are we doing? What is the nature of our relationship? Is it platonic? Is it romantic? Is it ongoing? Do we expect this to transition to dating? Is it casual, et cetera, et cetera? So we know that people aren't having those kinds of communications. I'm going to, in the weekly folder with this material, I'm going to link a video on YouTube. It's an oldie but a goodie. It is a clip from Seinfeld where two of the main characters, Elaine and Jerry, previously had dated, then they transitioned to strictly platonic, and there's a scene called The Deal, or This and That, where they are negotiating reintroducing a physical element into their friendship. It's really funny, and it is what most people are not doing in real life. In terms of outcomes, what happened when people tried a friends with benefits relationship? Here is what the research shows. 28% of respondents having a friends with benefits relationship said it was still ongoing, so was currently happening. It was they were in the midst of it. 36% had stopped having sex and went back to being just friends, and so they were successfully able to make that transition back to strictly platonic. 10% became romantically involved. Stability-wise, in terms of staying together, it tends to be the same as other relationships that didn't start as friends with benefits. But overall, couples that started as friends with benefits tended to have lower satisfaction. We don't know what this is, but my hypothesis is that perhaps it's because they got together while neither one was with someone else. Social exchange theory would say, maybe their market value wasn't that high because they were readily available. That's just one theoretical perspective. You might have a really different take. And 26% ended their relationship. So, and that means not only did they stop the sexual component, but they lost the friend as well. So what that tells us is engaging in a friends with benefits situation is a risk. Were there any sex differences across the respondents? Let's think theoretically about these things. What trends has the research identified? Well, one, it seems that women want the friends part more. Men want the benefits part more. But gender differences aren't huge. Again, as is the case for a lot of gender differences, there's not a big difference between men and women. A small difference of which one that they're prioritizing, but mostly men and women are the same. And this sort of hangs with what evolutionary theory might suggest. Also, what we are socialized to perform in terms of sexuality. Women are allowed to want the emotional support component. Men are allowed culturally to want the physical component publicly, right? So social norms for females is that there should be an emotional attachment for sex. And so, these results probably are influenced by reporting bias, by people talking about these issues, following the normative social scripts, the way that women should talk about it or men should talk about it. And I wonder if this trend won't look quite different in 10, 15 years from now. Let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages to friends with benefits relationships. So the advantages or the motivations for friends with benefits, the sex. We want that contact. If you are unattached, and you both are unattached, you can give that benefit to each other. We know that there is a whole host of positive health and behavioral outcomes for people that feel that they're getting satisfying physical intimacy, whatever that might look like, right? The individual gets to define what they consider physical intimacy and what they consider satisfying. But we know that people who say, yes, I am getting quality physical contact with another person, whatever behaviors that includes, those people tend to have a host of positive outcomes. So better mental health, better physical health, higher optimism, lower heart problems, you name it. Relationship simplicity is a stated benefit of friends with benefits. Because you are free of attachment and free of commitment, theoretically, there is more simplicity. Oftentimes, we know in actuality, one person catches feelings and this arrangement can become, messy or resentful, but it's at that time that the friends with benefits situation probably changes. The physical connection can actually substitute for emotional connections. What people report is that chemistry satisfies their need for intimacy, that they are not involved with someone that they really like or that's really special to them. They're not in love, quote unquote, but that the physical component still makes them feel, positive, cared for, desired, and these things, are experienced in a good way. There are, of course, some disadvantages. One person could start to want more romance than friendship, and if there's not agreement on that, it's complicated. There can be rather complex arrangements to negotiate the status of the relationship. It could ultimately hurt or ruin the friendship. And, it can cause negative emotions. It can cause hurt on one or both parties because one or both can be hurt by shifting expectations. There's a lot of uncertainty in this relationship structure about the status of the relationship, about the potential for the future, about what information is private versus public. It can feel like you are dating, like there is some kind of implied responsibility, commitment, increased interdependence. However, that is not the explicit agreement. So, yeah, I mean, this situation can be fraught with complications. This week's participation exercise is asking you to create a theory, your own theory about friends with benefits relationships. So based off of what I've talked about here in the lecture, what you've read in the text or the extra article, I want you to think about what brings some people together. Why do some platonic friendships shift to friends with benefits and others don't? What do you think predicts the outcome of a friends with benefits relationship, whether it turns into a full-blown romantic relationship, turns back into a platonic friendship, or the whole thing ends? What influences that? What factors lead to a successful friends with benefits relationship? And how would you define success in this situation? How do friends maintain the friends with benefits situation? What happens to the friends when the benefits end? I want you to give this some thought and give me your take on it. You could offer a list of important factors. You could create a visual model. Remember, a model is like a visual representation of a process. So how friends with benefits happen, how they start or how they end. You could write it up in a paragraph form, a couple paragraphs pitching a theoretical explanation about friends with benefits. Be creative. I just want you to put on your empirical lens. Think of this as a scholar and as, the kind of target audience of friends with benefits research, the participation pool. What do you think about it? And you can use your own anecdotal evidence as well as the academic material that we've covered in class. You will find the submission link for that in this week's Blackboard folder. Another short-term relationship that's enjoyed a lot of research attention and empirical data collection is the concept of the hookup, right? Sexual interactions with casual partners that last only one night with no expectation of a lasting relationship. What we know is, in terms of those polled, 3/4 of college students have reported that they have had a hookup. So there is lots of current research on the influence of the hookup culture, on sex, on dating, on marriage. And it's this idea that with hookups, there are no expectations. It's increasingly common. There is little risk of psychological damage. There are no real gender differences that emerge in the research in terms of, spontaneous casual sexual desire. Men and women seem to be equally interested. There is a slight variation between sexual orientation, but not so large that I think we need to unpack it at this point. So one question to ask is, if so many college age people, looking at that 18 to 24-year-old demographic, are reporting that they're engaging in hookups, we know that many of them are also reporting really high risk sexual behaviors. And so one question that communication scholars are trying to answer is, why do smart young adults like yourself, a college student, working on their education and expanding their skill set, gaining new life experience, why do so many of those people still engage in high risk sex behaviors? And so we have some data about that. Safe sex is an important topic of discussion for people in relationships. But according to one study, 99% of college students were confident that their partner did not have an STI. And we can take from that assumption that they probably also felt that if they were confident their partner didn't have an STI, then it was not something they needed to discuss. So this leads us to, we know that percentage, 99%, some of them were necessarily wrong. And so as communication scholars, we think about, what communication strategies might partners use to ensure that they engage in safe sex. And this is a list. This is, like kind of the PSA of safe sex. Practice abstinence or secondary abstinence if you can, avoid high-risk sex, use protection like condoms, get tested so you know your STI status, limit your partners and know their sexual history, avoid intoxication so that you don't have an inflated sense of safety, which we know happens when you are intoxicated. You believe that risks are less likely to happen to you. Being honest and upfront about your STI status. These are all great suggestions in theory, but we know that people don't always put them into practice, and in fact are usually are not putting them into practice. Why might that be the case? Well, one obvious answer is that, to do these things, there are a lot of potential face threats to your own positive face and to the other person's positive face, right? Even just the mention of using protection or your STI status implies that the other person, might have a need for that, right? Which most of the time people in this hookup situation are just trying to make sure that it happens and don't want anything to interrupt that eventuality. And these kinds of conversations can, quote unquote, dampen the mood. One of the most effective strategies in promoting safer sex in relationships, according to research cited in the text, is discussing pregnancy prevention or saying that you'd like to use a condom just to be safe. And you can see why this reason for using protection to prevent an unwanted pregnancy or, just to be safe, just in case, that is mitigating some of the positive face threats on the other person. You're saying, look, it's not that I think that you are diseased, it's that I don't want to create a baby right now with you, a relative stranger. Or, just to be safe, these are the recommended health practices, so we should do it, even though it's probably not necessary. I'd like to use a condom. So we can see some very strategic communication choices in how you phrase that conversation, and how you can promote safe sex while still having sex and while still maintaining a positive impression on the partner. People who know better, well-educated young adults, sometimes neglect to use condoms. And these are the reasons why they say. One, and we touched on this in the last slide, but one is they consider that conversation to be awkward or embarrassing. And we know that embarrassment leads to decreased intimacy and pleasure. Essentially, they're afraid it will kill the vibe. And um, so that is one of the major kind of roadblocks to open communication. Two is alcohol myopia. Alcohol myopia is the illusion of unique invulnerability. This is the idea that when you are intoxicated, you are aware that some things are risky, but you believe that that risk does not apply to you in that moment. So this is why, like people might drink and drive, or because they believe, yes, drinking and driving does lead to increased car accidents and fatalities, but not me tonight. And so alcohol myopia can also blind you to the potential consequences of unsafe sex. That yes, unsafe sex is a risk that you could contract an STI, but it won't happen to you this time. Pluralistic ignorance is sort of the ostrich burying their head in the sand. If we don't talk about it, we both assume that the other one is taking steps to be safe or to prevent pregnancy. It's the idea, like, if they're not bringing it up, then they must be on the pill. Or if they're not bringing up using a condom, they must be sure that they don't have an STI. However, that assumption is often faulty. According to one study, right, 99% of college students were confident that their partner did not have an STI. So people don't want to talk about protection. They also might be convinced that they don't need to. But there are different figures reported for the incidence of college students and STIs. But we can be certain that it at least reflects the general population and is therefore definitely higher than 1%. So that pluralistic ignorance, the alcohol myopia, the awkwardness, and then leads to not talking about it. Inequalities of power. This leads to a really cool concept that is applicable in all kinds of situations, this one included, but it is the principle of least interest. The principle of least interest says that whoever is more dependent on that relationship has less power. And so, that's if you are more into it, if you want it more, if you desire the partner more, or you have more invested into that person than they do into you, then you have less power in that relationship. And so what we know is if you apply the principle of least interest to hookups, whoever is more into it has less power and is therefore less likely to bring up conditions such as condom use. And so you can see how this plays out in long-term relationships as well, but the principle of least interest is certainly applicable in this hookup situation. And lastly, abstinence education. What we know from an empirical point of view, from the observable data, is that there is no safer way to ensure unwanted teenage pregnancies than abstinence-only education. It is a spectacular public health failure. A lot of states mandate abstinence-only education, and in those states, surprise, surprise, there is an enormously larger proportion of unplanned teen pregnancies. These kids lack the scripts to talk about safe sex. They haven't had it modeled. They're not sure how to do it. They're teenagers, so talk about the awkward factor. It's way higher because they're still figuring out their own identities and who they are. They're oftentimes they're inexperienced, so they're afraid of doing it wrong. It increases fears of awkwardness or face threats, and so abstinence education as your only sexual health education background also really increases people's chances of making some risky sexual health decisions, perhaps unknowingly. They might just not know better. So now let's switch gears into longer term relationship. So we're going to switch from short term to long term. If you feel like you need a break, this is a good place to take one and then, hop back in. But let's start the conversation with this larger cultural idiom about marriage and a jar of pennies. Now, some of you may have heard this before. It is a cultural narrative. It is a story. It is a joke that is told over and over. And it goes that an old man tells a young man, for every time you have sex in courtship during dating, put a penny in a jar. Then, when you're married, take a penny out every time you have sex. And this sad tale goes that the old man asks when do you think, young man, that jar will be empty? And the young man says, surely in the first year. And the old man says, I've been married for 50 years and there's still pennies in that jar. Wah, wah. This is sort of the cultural tale of the decline of sex once relationships become committed and long term. But while every cultural idiom does have some grain of truth, the good news is the research shows that while this is a story we tell each other over and over, it might not actually reflect reality at all. According to your textbook, what type of relationships have the most satisfying sex? In fact, long-term romantic relationships like marriages or long-term partnerships. We also know that sex and relationship satisfaction is best when people communicate effectively with each other. So, what that means is people have better sex lives when they're able to communicate effectively with their partner, when they are able to engage in healthy conflict, when they're able to share meaning with one another. And that actually leads to sex that they are happier with, and that leads to general overall higher levels of happiness in life. So it is a causal chain. The better you communicate, the better you feel about sex, the better you feel about life. And that's some good news. However, 50% of husbands and 75% of wives in heterosexual marriages have reported some sexual difficulty in their marriage. And so what this means is that, going through a rough patch or a dry spell, in terms of like the cultural language that we have around this, is actually totally normal, that most people report at some point that they're experiencing that. So how can communication help them? Direct communication about sex facilitates satisfaction. So the more, and again, this relationship research is rooted in heterosexual couples, but I just want to note that there doesn't seem to be any major differences between the heterosexual research and the same-sex couples research. So technically, these results are coming out of reporting from opposite sex couples, but we have no evidence to support that it would be different in any other kind of relationship. And a lot of amazing scholars are closing that gap on same-sex and opposite-sex relationship research. Soon, we'll have plenty of empirical data to say with absolute certainty there is no difference between same-sex and opposite couples on this, or if there is a difference, here's what that difference is. So for our intents and purposes, we can assume that this applies to all relationships. So one is that direct communication about sex facilitates satisfaction. When two people feel that they are able to speak openly about what they are happy with, not happy with, what they are feeling, the changes that they desire, then both parties feel like the sex is better. Two, good communication leads to greater sexual satisfaction. So being able to speak openly and directly leads people to feel that the quality of their communication is higher. It seems to be in that order. So open, honest, direct communication, if that is allowed, if that is encouraged, if that is embraced, within that relationship, then they feel better about that communication and subsequently about the sex that they're having. We know in terms of a gendered difference, men prefer clear instrumental disclosure. So these are very much brass tacks, do this, don't do that. And that women don't care as much about how often they're having sex as much as they care about when they are having it, if it is quote unquote quality. And the individual gets to define what they consider quality, but I'm sure you could come to some conclusions of your own that most people would share about what makes sexual interaction quality or not. And lastly, supportive communication is important. So, from the reading, that idea of social support, esteem, you can do it, emotional, I care about you, instrumental, here's what you are capable of, here's how to do it. Supportive communication is very important. This is closely correlated and tied to feelings of satisfaction about not only the communication, but also the sex. In long-term relationships, both men and women place a high value on qualities such as interpersonal skills, emotional stability, and emotional regulation. So in the event that someone is feeling negative emotions, that they're not all over the place, or that they're able to express them in a manageable way, not having extreme ups and downs. Responsiveness, attending to your partner, not ignoring them. Affection, both physical and emotional, and family orientation. Also, over the long term, less value on physical attraction. So in long-term relationships, what we see is people still value physical attraction to their partner. I like his beard, I like her butt kind of conversation, but also their social and task attraction. I love how he's a wonderful father. I love how she is a real go-getter and is crushing her career. I love how he is thoughtful and attentive to our extended family. I love how she makes such an effort with my friends. In long-term relationships, physical attraction becomes less important than in early relationships, and other forms of attraction share the stage with physical attraction. Okay, so this is pulled from the text, and asterisk, this information is all in keeping with evolutionary theory, which I do not believe is the best theoretical perspective for understanding adult relationships. It is simplistic. It boils down communication conundrums into biological imperatives for reproduction. I've said this before, but it is worth repeating. Not every person's motivation is centered around reproduction. There are huge periods in people's life development where reproduction is not a motivator at all. And some people aren't interested in becoming parents ever. So that must be said before we proceed. But setting my critique aside, the text states that there are some sex differences between men and women on sex in long-term relationships. Biologically, women invest more time and resources in becoming a parent. Now, empirically, this is accurate, right? For women, reproduction involves finding a mate, having sex, going through pregnancy and childbirth, and raising that child into adulthood. There is a biological connection throughout all of those stages. For men, only finding a mate and having sex are the biological imperatives. They could dip out after that point, and that child would exist and carry their genes forward into future generations. But while that might be descriptive of the process, we know that in today's society, that's not the whole picture. And this is one of the places where we look at the conversation around the sexless marriage, and there seems to be sort of a cultural story that we tell that women have a lower sex drive, that women just generally are less interested in sex, that some women are fine without sex altogether. And what we know is it's probably not at all about this reproductive motivation or dilemma. It's that the female sex drive is a lot more socially flexible, adaptable, and responsive than the male sex drive. And that's a different way of telling this story. Men and women also differ in terms of sexual desire and sexual attraction. So the cultural story is that men have stronger sex drives than women, and there is some empirical evidence for this. But I should note that difference is very slight. It appears that most healthy functioning adults have strong sex drives, and that men's might be slightly elevated as a group if you average them all out as compared to women. But on the individual basis, you don't see huge differences. Uh, this is reflected in orientation differences as well that we'll get to. So men experience greater sexual arousal in response to short-term sexual opportunity than women do. This would be in keeping with that evolutionary theory that they're primed for that beginning element of the process of the finding the mate and the intercourse. Women, in contrast, are sexually attracted to men who are relationally oriented, emotionally connected, and who show tenderness and intimacy with them. Now, if we are using that evolutionary theory lens, this would make sense too, because these are the partners that are going to protect them and their offspring when they're vulnerable. However, we have to remember social desirability. This just also might be the way that we have socialized women to talk about sex, that we have trained women to make emotional and socioeconomic connections, and that the socially acceptable way to discuss sex for women is to talk about tenderness, intimacy, emotional connection, and that men are not socialized to talk about it in that way. They are allowed to talk about conquest and pleasure. And so, some of this data comes out of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and I believe that as we move forward and there's more gender equality, especially with millennials and Gen Z reporting on this, we'll see these differences recede or disappear altogether. Women's sexual desire is more dependent on feelings, the type of relationship they share with their partner, and the potential for intimacy and humor. Also, the status and intelligence of the man. Men's desire is more influenced by physical attraction, sexual pleasure, and erotic qualities. Okay, true, but the real takeaway is that all people want all of those things. The gender difference here, again, is very slight. So slight as to almost not be statistically significant at all. So what we know is all people, given their druthers, want all of these things. Here is some data that flies in the face of that jar of pennies story. Spouses and long-term cohabitating partners, so legally married and not, have sex more often than singles do. So single people, but of the same age bracket, are having less sex than their married and partnered counterparts. And also, the frequency of intercourse does tend to decrease with age. We see that the bell curve kind of dropping off. Older people generally have sex much less often than younger people do. But, so yes, sex decreases with age, but those who are married have more sex at every age. Sexual attitudes are obviously going to be influenced by the context that a person is in. So that includes that relationship, but also that family system, that geographic location, that period in time, that nation. Culture is really important for forming people's take on sex and sociosexuality. So the social norms of your culture obviously are going to be really influential. And, we can look at something like the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 1970s and the huge change that created in general thinking and in subsequent behaviors. Positive attitudes towards sexual activity, especially among females, has steadily increased from the 1960s forward. And part of that is because we have sort of changed some of the social norms around what is allowed, what is considered positive, what is acceptable. So our cultural values have shifted and behaviors have changed to reflect that. Research reported in the textbook suggests that individuals who have had positive sexual experiences in past committed relationships are more likely to expect future relationships to be monogamous and sexually satisfying. And this makes sense. If you have had a track record of good experiences with committed partners, even if they are not your lifelong partner, then that would lead you to expect similar positive experiences in the future. And so this is about shaping attitudes and how that reflects back into behavior and expectations. So let's talk a little bit more about attitudes. Your sexual attitude is really asking, what do you perceive is the function of sex? And researchers have identified 3 types of attitudes held by people today: procreational, relational, and recreational. These are not mutually exclusive. You can hold multiple attitudes at once. Procreational is more practical. This is having kids and making babies. Producing offspring is the primary purpose. Some religious views are obviously related to this. An individual difference called religiosity, or how conservative and committed you are to a particular religious viewpoint, tends to be associated with lower sociosexuality. So the more conservatively religious you are, the less positively you feel about sex generally. Therefore, fundamentalist religious communities oftentimes, require a moral purpose for sex. And that moral purpose is children, procreation. Cultures with fundamentalist religious orientation are likely to have a very procreational attitude towards sex. Relational attitudes view that sex expresses intimacy, affection, develops the relationship. It is a way of expressing love. So sex is used to help further or maintain. We know that it helps if you and your partner are on the same page in terms of attitudes, so what you think sex is for. And we see that couples will negotiate prioritizing different functions at different times of the relationship. And this is one way that we see relational partners increasing communication satisfaction and sexual satisfaction with each other, especially in long-term monogamous relationships. Couples that report high dyadic satisfaction tend to be on the same page in terms of their attitudes at any given time. Sexual frequency and satisfaction. Most people say they're quite satisfied with their sex lives, but satisfaction with sex is tied to its frequency. So this might seem obvious, but there are several reasons why. People who have sex more often are happier with their sex lives than those who have sex less frequently. It might be about the quantity more so than the quality in long-term relationships. So again, this is kind of a chicken or the egg situation. If sex stops in relationships, it's usually not the problem, it's the symptom of a problem. And so what we see is people who self-report as having sex frequently in their long-term relationship tend to be more satisfied. Now, it's worth noting here that people get to self-identify what they consider frequent. And that's going to change very much from person to person, or couple to couple in this case. So, for one couple, frequently might mean 3 times a week. For another couple, frequently might mean 3 times a year. It really is about like how much do they think is a satisfying amount. Sex and relationship satisfaction. We know that couples who are happy with their sex lives tend to be happy with their relationships as well. So, this is a chicken or the egg kind of situation as well. Good sex probably makes a partnership more gratifying, but a happy, loving relationship makes the sex better too. And this can have a lot to do with attributions and perceptions, how we perceive things, and what kind of spin, whether it's positive or negative, we put on that relationship. And so this is sort of some um, nice news too from communication scholars about long-term relationships that also would disagree with that jar of pennies story. So we will stop here. Again, this chapter is huge. There's a lot of other really interesting, cool stuff that is happening in it, and you can enjoy that in the reading. But we will focus on the content that I have covered here today in this lecture.